When I saw my husband leaning against the kitchen counter, watching me with that unreadable expression, my heart sank, not from fear, but from knowing he suspected something, even if he couldn't yet name it. The morning light cut across the room, throwing long shadows, and there he stood, silent, arms crossed, looking at me as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. I kept my hands busy with the kettle, pouring water that steamed in the cold air, but inside my chest, panic thudded with every breath. There were no incriminating texts on my phone, no hidden messages in my email, but there were moments, looks I hadn't erased, pauses that couldn't be undone. He didn't need proof to feel the shift, he could sense it. His eyes narrowed slightly when the sound of footsteps upstairs interrupted us. That was the sound that changed everything. The sound of his father walking across the landing, his suitcase still by the bedroom door, his life now tangled with ours. I knew this was how it all began, not with a confession, not with guilt spilling out over a table, but with the quiet terror of being seen too closely. And maybe before I go on, you should ask yourself, have you ever let someone cross a line you didn't even see until it was too late? When he moved into our house, it wasn't supposed to mean anything. That's what I told myself the morning his car pulled into the driveway, the trunk filled with boxes, his eyes tired from a night spent somewhere between regret and exhaustion. He had just finalized his divorce, and the idea was that he would stay for a few weeks, until he gets back on his feet, my husband said, as if we were doing a good deed. And I believed it. Or wanted to. The first morning, I found him in the kitchen, opening cabinets, trying to remember where the mugs were. The sight startled me, not because of the intrusion, but because of how normal it felt. He thanked me when I handed him coffee, his voice softer than I remembered, almost grateful in a way that made me uneasy. My husband breezed in a few minutes later, cheerful, as if this arrangement didn't weigh on him at all. It'll be nice to have the company, he said, and I caught the way his father's eyes flicked toward me when he said it, just briefly, just enough to notice. By the second day, the house already felt different. There were his shoes by the door, his jacket on the back of a chair, his low humming in the mornings when I was still half asleep. Small things, but they unsettled the rhythm I'd built with my husband over the years. I found myself reaching for clothes more carefully, picking earrings to wear with my sweater when I normally wouldn't have cared. It wasn't about vanity, it was about awareness, the kind that creeps in when you feel watched, even if you tell yourself you aren't. My husband didn't seem to mind the changes. He seemed almost lighter, as though his father's presence was a relief. He worked longer hours, stayed out later, leaving me to handle dinner, conversation, the quiet pauses that stretched too long across the table. You don't mind keeping him company, do you? He asked once, barely looking up from his phone. And I said no, of course not. What else could I say? It wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle, like the way he would stay in the kitchen when I cooked, offering to chop vegetables or stir sauce, even if I didn't need the help. Like the way his stories about his failed marriage turned into reflections on loneliness, on the ache of sharing a home with someone who stopped seeing you. I listened, telling myself it was empathy, not connection. But inside, something shifted. One evening, he told me about the day he packed his things, how his wife stood at the window, not saying a word. It's strange, he said quietly, to leave a house and feel like no one noticed you were ever there. The way he said it, his voice low and raw, made me feel like he wasn't just talking about himself. I should have seen the warning signs. The way my husband would leave in the mornings with a kiss on my cheek, oblivious, or maybe not. The way I'd start dinner early, knowing his father liked to sit and talk while things simmered. The way I caught myself brushing my hair before coming downstairs, just because. There was one evening, only a week after he'd moved in, when I stood on the back porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. He came out quietly, leaning on the railing beside me. We didn't speak at first. There was no reason to. The air felt heavy, not with words, but with all the things neither of us had the courage to name. Looking back now, I think that's where the line began to blur, not with touch, not with words, but with silence. That dangerous kind of silence that feels like an invitation. I didn't know then how far it would go, or what it would cost. I only knew that the house no longer felt like mine, or my husband's. It felt like something else entirely, something shifting under the weight of too many unspoken things. The next morning began with the ordinary noises of a house already awake, the creak of the stair railing, the shuffle of feet on the hardwood floor, the kettle boiling somewhere in the distance. But something about it felt different, sharper, like every sound was a reminder of who was sharing this space now. I walked into the kitchen and found him there before me, already dressed, already moving about like he belonged. He was searching for sugar, and the way he turned to thank me when I handed it to him was too warm, too lingering for something so small. I told myself I was imagining it, that the awkwardness was only mine. But as we stood there, the counter between us suddenly felt like the only barrier holding a strange kind of gravity in check. When my husband came in moments later, all easy charm and casual smiles, that barrier seemed even thinner. He kissed me on the cheek in a perfunctory way, barely looking, before heading out the door, tossing over his shoulder, "I'll be late tonight. Don't wait up." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. I watched the door close behind him, listened to his car start, and felt the silence that followed. His father and I stood there, two people who were supposed to be family, but the stillness between us didn't feel like family at all. The day moved slowly. He lingered in the kitchen while I folded laundry in the next room, asked if I needed help carrying a basket upstairs, and I said no, too quickly, too firmly. He stepped back, nodded, and yet I saw the flicker of something in his eyes before he turned away. That flicker unsettled me more than anything he could have said outright. Later that afternoon, I went out onto the porch with a cup of tea, hoping the cool air would clear my head. He came out a few minutes later, holding his own mug, like it was the most natural thing in the world. We talked, but not really. He asked how long I'd been married, how my husband and I met, what drew me to him back then. The questions felt harmless, but my answers felt strange in my mouth, as if they belonged to someone else. By evening, the house had settled into that half-lit quiet that comes when the day is ending but no one is ready to turn on the lamps. I was chopping vegetables for dinner when I dropped the knife, startled by the sudden closeness of him behind me, reaching to open a cupboard. His arm brushed mine, lightly, accidentally, and yet the contact stayed with me long after he'd stepped back. It wasn't deliberate, I told myself. These things happen in tight kitchens. But later, as we sat down to eat, the memory of it made the silence louder. We filled it with talk about weather, about groceries, about nothing at all, but underneath, there was something heavier neither of us dared to touch. When the plates were cleared, I found myself restless, wandering from room to room, not wanting to sit still. He was in the living room, sorting through old photo albums my husband had left out, smiling at pictures from years ago. "You were so young here," he said softly, pointing to an image of me at some forgotten holiday, my hair shorter, my smile easier. I didn't know what to say. Compliment or observation, it didn't matter, the words landed in a place I'd been ignoring for too long. That place that missed being seen, really seen, beyond the routine roles of wife and hostess and background figure in someone else's life. Much later, after dishes were washed and the house was quiet, I stood at the window, looking out into the dark yard. The glass reflected my own face back at me, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. Something was changing. Something was already changed. I heard the floorboards behind me creak. He had come back into the room, softly, like he didn't want to disturb me. When I turned, our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us looked away. It was only a second, long enough for the unspoken to feel heavier than anything we'd said that day. And then, in that moment when silence seemed to pull us closer instead of apart, we kissed. There were no words after, no explanations, no apologies. Just the sudden awareness that the line I thought I could keep clear was already blurred. The morning after the kiss, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually meant peace, but that morning it felt suffocating. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my body still and heavy, while my mind replayed what had happened on the porch the night before. There was no undoing it. No way to file it under accident or misunderstanding. It had been real, and that reality clung to me like the scent of smoke on a sweater, subtle but impossible to ignore. When I finally got out of bed, I could already hear movement downstairs. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs, and for a second I considered staying in my room, letting him handle his morning alone. But hiding wasn't an option. The house wasn't big enough for that, and the truth already sat between us like an unwelcome guest. I walked into the kitchen and saw him at the counter, his hand around a mug, his shoulders hunched slightly as if he'd been awake for hours. He looked up when I entered, and for the briefest moment, there was something raw in his expression, guilt, maybe, or confusion, or just the weight of knowing what we'd done. He offered me coffee. I nodded. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't empty either. It had a charge to it, an edge that made me hyper-aware of every sound, the spoon clinking against the mug, the faint hum of the fridge, even the sound of his breathing. My husband wasn't home that morning. He'd left early, leaving only a scribbled note on the counter about work meetings and late dinners. I thought about that note while I drank my coffee. He trusted me. He trusted us. That thought should have grounded me, but instead it tilted the room sideways. Because trust wasn't a shield anymore, it was a mirror, and every glance I gave it reflected my betrayal back at me. Later in the morning, I decided to run errands, to do something normal, something that didn't feel tainted by last night. He asked if I wanted company. The question came out casual, too casual, as if he didn't care either way. But there was a softness in his tone that made me pause for a second too long before answering. Sure, I said, though I wasn't sure at all. We drove together into town, the radio on low, filling the silence neither of us dared to fill with real words. Outside, the world looked ordinary, school buses stopping at corners, people walking dogs, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks. Inside the car, everything felt like it was underlined, like even the small talk carried too much weight. At the store, we moved through aisles side by side, talking about groceries like nothing was wrong. But there were moments when our hands brushed reaching for the same item, moments when I caught his eyes lingering on me longer than necessary. Each one was a tiny spark, dangerous in its own right, and I hated that I noticed every one of them. On the drive back, he told me more about his divorce. Not the big, dramatic pieces, I already knew those, but the quieter humiliations, the birthdays forgotten, the meals eaten in silence, the slow erosion of something that once felt permanent. It's strange, he said, how two people can share a house and live separate lives. The words stuck to me like burrs. Because they were about his marriage, but they were also about mine. When we got home, I tried to reset the day. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopped vegetables, set the table, acted as if dinner prep could erase what was happening in my head. He stayed nearby, offering to help, staying just close enough that I felt his presence even when my back was turned. At one point, he reached past me to grab a cutting board, and his arm brushed mine again, an ordinary touch in an ordinary kitchen, but it felt anything but ordinary. I flinched, though not from discomfort, and when I looked up, he was watching me, his expression unreadable. That evening, my husband called. His voice was cheerful, detached, the way it always was when work consumed him. He told me not to wait for dinner. You two can eat without me, he said. And then, more lightly, it's nice he's there, though, right? Less lonely for you. Less lonely. The words caught me off guard. After the call, we ate together again. The meal was quiet, but not empty. Every glance, every pause felt heavy with things unsaid. When the dishes were washed and the kitchen cleared, I stood by the window again, staring at the yard, the dark settling over the grass like a blanket. I thought of the kiss. Not the act itself, but the way it changed the air around us. It hadn't been passionate or calculated, it had been hesitant, unsure, a slip into something neither of us planned. But it was also undeniable. He walked into the room behind me. I felt it before I saw it, the subtle shift in air, the faint sound of the floorboards. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. We didn't speak about what happened the night before. Neither of us mentioned it. But the silence wasn't a shield anymore, it was a rope, binding us to something neither of us knew how to name. By the time I went to bed, I told myself again that I could control this, that I could pull back, draw a line, keep everything in place. But even as I lay there in the dark, I knew that line had already been crossed, and no amount of denial would redraw it. The rain started just after lunch, a steady, insistent drizzle that turned the sky the color of ash and made the air smell of wet earth. I stood by the back door watching the drops streak down the glass, telling myself I'd wait for it to ease before heading out for errands. But the rain didn't ease. It thickened into something heavier, almost a curtain, and by mid-afternoon the yard was a blur of water and mist. He appeared in the doorway behind me, his voice low, asking if I needed help bringing in the laundry I'd hung out that morning. I hadn't even thought about it until then, shirts, sheets, and towels clinging damply to the line, probably already soaked through. I started to say no, but stopped. The words felt false before I could even say them. So I just nodded, and together we stepped into the rain. The path to the clothesline wasn't long, but the rain made it feel endless. We moved quickly, wordlessly, pulling down wet fabric, shaking water from it, piling it into the basket. My hair clung to my face, rain soaking through my sweater until it felt like another layer of skin. I saw him glance at me once, not in a way that felt inappropriate, but in a way that made me suddenly aware of myself, of the cold fabric against my arms, of the way my breath fogged in the damp air. By the time we carried the basket inside, we were both dripping. He set it down in the laundry room and stood there for a moment, his hair darkened by the rain, his shirt plastered to his shoulders. I reached for a towel, handed it to him, and our hands brushed again, just a brief touch, but enough to bring back every memory of the kiss we hadn't spoken of. The rest of the afternoon moved slowly, like the rain itself. We spread the wet clothes over chairs and banisters, trying to save what we could. The house smelled of damp fabric and wood, the kind of smell that lingers long after the rain has passed. I busied myself in the kitchen, making tea, anything to keep my hands moving. He joined me, leaning on the counter, his eyes following my movements. We talked about nothing, the weather, the rain's effect on the garden, whether the tomatoes would survive the week, but beneath those words, something else hummed quietly. Every glance felt weighted, every pause louder than the sentences around it. At one point, I knocked over the spoon jar on the counter. The sound startled both of us, a sharp clatter in the soft patter of rain. I bent to pick them up, and so did he. Our heads nearly collided, and we both laughed, an awkward, too quick laugh that didn't reach our eyes. When I stood, I caught the way his smile faltered, the way his gaze lingered just a moment longer than it should have before he looked away. As evening approached, the rain grew heavier. The power flickered twice but didn't go out. I lit a few candles anyway, telling myself it was for practicality, but even I didn't fully believe it. Their soft light made the kitchen feel smaller, closer, like the air between us was pressing in. Dinner was quiet again, though not tense. He asked if I missed my husband when he worked late, and I hesitated before answering. "I've gotten used to it," I said. It was the truth, but it sounded colder than I meant it to. He didn't reply right away, just nodded, his eyes focused on the edge of his plate. After dinner, the rain finally began to ease. We both ended up on the back porch, the air smelling of wet leaves, the wood beneath our feet still slick. The silence between us didn't feel empty, it felt like the space between two breaths, a pause that could stretch or break at any second. He told me about the last day in his old house, how he stood in the driveway with a box in his hands, waiting for someone to say something, and no one did. The story wasn't dramatic, but the way he told it left something heavy in the air. I wanted to comfort him, but the words felt tangled in my throat. The light faded, leaving the porch in shadows. I could feel the cool air on my skin, the faint hum of insects just beyond the yard, the steady drip of water from the roof. And there, in that half-dark, it felt like the world had narrowed to just that small space, to just the two of us. When I finally went back inside, my clothes smelled of rain, and my thoughts felt soaked through too. The house felt unfamiliar again, like the walls were holding secrets I hadn't meant to tell. Lying in bed later, I thought about how easily things slipped from innocent to complicated, how quickly a gesture could mean something it wasn't meant to mean. I thought about the kiss, about the silence that followed, about the way every shared task now felt like it carried more weight than it should. And I realized something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't only that a line had been crossed, it was that I wasn't sure anymore where the line even was. The following days moved in a haze of small, ordinary moments that felt anything but ordinary. Breakfasts became slow rituals, filled with an unspoken tension that hovered between us. Every movement felt measured, how long I lingered by the coffee pot, how close he stood when he reached for a mug, how his hand brushed the counter just an inch from mine. My husband's absences seemed to grow longer, stretching into the evenings without warning. His texts were brief, practical, "Don't wait for me tonight, late meetings, back late." It left me with too much quiet, too much room for thoughts I didn't want to have. One evening, I decided to bring some order to the chaos in the attic. It wasn't planned, I simply needed something to keep my hands busy. The boxes were old, labeled in my handwriting from years ago. He offered to help, and I hesitated, then nodded, because refusing would have felt stranger than agreeing. The attic was warm and dusty, lit by a single weak bulb. We moved slowly, sorting through old clothes, forgotten books, stacks of photographs. I found myself narrating the past, where this picture was taken, how that old coat had once been my favorite. He listened with a kind of focus that felt disarming, like the past mattered simply because it was mine. At one point, I reached for a box on a high shelf and misjudged the weight of it. It tilted, slipping from my grasp, and before I could react, he steadied it with one hand and me with the other. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, firm, steady, nothing dramatic, but the contact jolted through me. I tried to laugh it off, a nervous sound that didn't sound like me. "Guess I should have let you do the heavy lifting," I said, and my voice felt too bright, too thin. He didn't let go immediately. Not too long, not in a way that could be called deliberate, but long enough for me to feel the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his hold. When he did let go, the absence of it felt sharper than the touch itself. We carried boxes down the narrow stairs, one by one, the weight giving us an excuse not to speak much. But even in silence, I felt it, that charged awareness, that sense that every shared space had become something else entirely. When we finally finished, the living room was cluttered with memories, photo albums, mismatched dishes, forgotten holiday decorations. We sat for a moment among them, not speaking, catching our breath. The quiet felt heavier than the boxes. He picked up one of the albums, flipping through pages with care, pausing over a picture of me from years ago. I was younger, hair shorter, smiling wide at something outside the frame. "You look different there," he said, his voice soft, almost distant. I wasn't sure if it was meant as a compliment or an observation. I wasn't sure which one I wanted it to be. That evening, the kitchen felt too small again. I chopped vegetables at the counter, and he stood nearby, leaning against the doorframe. There was no reason for him to be there, no conversation to finish, no task to help with, but he stayed. I felt the weight of his presence even when I didn't look up. I thought about the kiss, the one we hadn't spoken of, the one that sat between us like a line neither of us wanted to cross again but neither of us could erase. And then, before I could stop myself, I looked up. Our eyes met. There was no pretense this time, no accident to hide behind, no rain or sudden movement to blame. There was just the silence between us, and then we kissed. It was brief, but it was deliberate. When we pulled apart, we didn't speak. Words would have broken something fragile, and neither of us seemed ready for that. Dinner went on as if nothing had happened, plates filled, dishes washed, the ordinary rituals of an ordinary night. But under the surface, everything was altered. That night, when I lay in bed, my husband's side of the mattress cold and empty, I stared at the ceiling again. I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself since the first kiss: I could stop this. I could draw a line. But the truth had become undeniable. Lines were easier to draw when you hadn't already crossed them twice. The days after the second kiss felt like walking across a frozen lake, each step measured, every sound amplified, knowing that at any moment the ice might crack. The house itself seemed to notice the change. The air felt heavier, as though walls and windows could sense the shift in what we had done. I tried to fold myself into routine, laundry, groceries, the endless cycle of ordinary tasks, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Even washing dishes carried a weight, because I could feel him standing behind me sometimes, close enough that I sensed his presence without seeing him. Every simple action had an echo now, a shadow of meaning that shouldn't have been there. My husband's schedule kept stretching further into the evenings. Back late, his messages read, short and detached, and I wondered if he even realized what he was leaving behind, or if he did and simply didn't care. Sometimes I imagined asking him outright, but the thought died before it reached my mouth. It was during one of those long absences that I noticed something small, but sharp as a splinter, the way my husband's eyes lingered on us when he was home. He didn't say anything, not directly, but there were glances, longer than they should have been, and questions phrased as casual remarks. "You two seem to get along well," he said one morning, not looking at me as he tied his shoes. It was a simple comment, but it stuck to me for the rest of the day. That afternoon, I found him, his father, at the dining table, sifting through a box of old photographs my husband had left out. The images spilled across the wood, family vacations, birthdays, blurry snapshots of lives that felt like they belonged to other people. He held up one of me, younger by decades, my smile wider, easier, my hair caught in the wind. "You look different here," he said, his tone not quite wistful, not quite casual. I didn't respond at first. The photograph felt like a stranger staring back at me. Eventually, I muttered something about age, about time changing everyone. But the truth lodged itself deeper. It wasn't just time. It was me, too. We sat in silence for a long time, the table cluttered with memories neither of us could fully touch. The quiet wasn't awkward, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was a quiet that made my heart beat louder in my ears, that made me aware of the smallest sounds, the scrape of his chair, the faint rustle of a photo being turned. Later that week, he dropped a book in the living room, and as he bent to pick it up, a stack of magazines tipped and slid to the floor. Among them was a thin photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. He opened it without thinking, and there it was, an old family picture, the three of us frozen in time. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I looked at that image, my husband with his arm around me, his father standing just behind, the three of us smiling for a camera that couldn't have guessed what we'd become. He noticed my stare, closed the album, and for a second we both avoided each other's eyes. That avoidance spoke louder than anything we could have said. Dinner that night was strange. My husband sat at the head of the table, his phone face down beside his plate. He watched us in a way that wasn't overt but wasn't subtle either. His questions seemed casual. How was the day? Did you two go anywhere? But the pauses between them felt pointed, like traps laid carefully in conversation. I found myself fumbling, over-explaining small things that didn't need explaining. I hated how easy it was to sound guilty even when I wasn't saying anything incriminating. I hated that my voice trembled slightly when I laughed at something harmless he said. Later, when my husband stepped out to take a call, the silence left behind felt unbearable. His father stayed at the table, eyes on his plate, and I stayed too, my hands folded, unable to move. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder than anything else in the room. I realized then that the tension wasn't just about us anymore. It wasn't only the two of us holding the weight of what we'd done. It was the unspoken suspicion in my husband's glance, the way he seemed to hover just outside the edges of our shared space, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. That night, I lay in bed again staring at the ceiling, but this time the thoughts were darker, heavier. I thought about the kisses, the first hesitant, the second deliberate, and about how they hung between us like invisible threads, impossible to untangle. I thought, too, about my husband, about the way he left and returned like a tide I couldn't predict. About the way his silences now felt like questions, and his questions felt like warnings. And for the first time, a new thought crept in, quiet but persistent. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he'd known from the start. The thought kept me awake long after the house had gone still. The night he left for another business trip, the house felt hollow from the moment his car disappeared down the street. He had been distracted all day, tossing clothes into a bag without much thought, his phone ringing in short bursts that ended with quick, clipped replies. When he kissed me on the cheek before walking out the door, it felt mechanical, a habit performed without meaning. I stood in the doorway watching the taillights vanish, the darkness swallowing them whole. The house seemed too quiet after that, every creak of the wood, every hum of the appliances amplified. It was in that quiet that I realized how much I'd been dreading this moment, even as part of me had been expecting it. The evening began with simple, harmless things. I made tea. I folded laundry. He, his father, sat at the table reading, or pretending to. We exchanged small talk that fell flat, words that felt like a bridge we weren't sure we wanted to cross. At some point, we ended up in the kitchen together, standing too close at the counter as we put dishes away. His hand brushed mine as we both reached for the same plate. It was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. The hours seemed to slow. We found ourselves in the living room, the television on but barely watched, the light from the screen flickering over our faces. Neither of us spoke much. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't hostile either. It was a silence filled with weight, the kind that makes every breath feel deliberate. At one point, I went to get another blanket from the hall closet. When I turned, he was there, standing closer than I expected, the hallway narrow between us. Our eyes met for just a second, and that second held every unanswered question we'd been circling around for weeks. What happened next didn't feel like a choice in the way choices normally do. It felt inevitable, like a tide that had been pulling us both for longer than we'd admitted. That night, we spent the night together. When morning came, the light felt harsh. I woke early, the room unfamiliar in its stillness. For a moment, I stayed still, not wanting to move, not wanting to acknowledge what the day would bring. He was quiet too. We barely spoke as we moved through the motions of morning, coffee, dishes, opening curtains. The silence between us wasn't the same as before. It wasn't hesitant or cautious. It was heavy. I kept thinking about my husband. About the bag he had packed, the car that had pulled away, the way he hadn't looked back. I thought about the trust he'd left behind, or the illusion of trust, and wondered if he somehow already knew what would happen in his absence. As the day wore on, the house felt smaller. Every room felt like it held a secret now. Every wall felt like it had witnessed something. Even the simplest things, pouring water into a glass, picking up a dropped spoon, felt loaded, like they carried an entirely new weight. That evening, I looked out the window and saw his car coming up the street, and for the first time in days, my breath caught. Because I realized then that no matter how quiet we tried to make it, no matter how careful we thought we were being, something fundamental had shifted. There was no going back. When my husband's car pulled back into the driveway that evening, I felt my stomach tighten in a way that was almost physical. From the window, I watched him unload his bag from the trunk, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He wasn't rushing inside the way he used to after long trips. He took his time, stood for a moment on the porch as if listening to the house before he even opened the door. The moment he stepped inside, the air shifted. He greeted us in that easy, polite way of his, smiling slightly as if nothing about the house or the people in it had changed. But his eyes lingered a fraction too long, not just on me, not just on his father, but on the space between us, the invisible current we'd been trying to bury under silence and routine. Dinner that night felt like a performance, one where all three of us knew our lines but none of us wanted to say them. My husband asked questions that seemed casual on the surface. How was your week? Did you two manage here without me? But every word felt like it was pressing at the edges of something deeper. I found myself talking too much about groceries, about the rain, about anything that could fill the silence. My voice sounded brittle, like glass about to crack. He, his father, barely spoke at all. He answered when spoken to, kept his gaze mostly on his plate. But there was a stillness to him, a watchfulness that felt almost louder than any words. At one point, my husband leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said, almost idly, "It's good to see you two getting along so well." The sentence was delivered lightly, almost like a joke, but it landed hard. I felt heat crawl up my neck, and I forced a smile, one that felt too tight. I glanced at him, his father, and he was staring down at his fork as though studying it could keep him from reacting. The rest of dinner passed in a fog. I heard myself answering questions, making small talk, but the words felt disconnected from me, like I was listening to someone else speak. Every clink of cutlery sounded too loud, every pause too long. After we cleared the dishes, my husband went upstairs to unpack. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs felt like a countdown, like the ticking of some unseen clock. I stood in the kitchen wiping the counter long after it was already clean, just to have something to do with my hands. Later, he came back down and sat in the living room, his phone in his hand but his attention elsewhere. He watched us move around the room, not staring, not accusing, but noticing. Every glance felt like it carried weight, and I couldn't decide if it was suspicion or just observation. The house felt smaller than it ever had. Every doorway felt narrow, every room crowded even when there were only 3 of us in it. I caught myself holding my breath when I passed between them, as if my silence could make me invisible. That night, when I finally went to bed, I lay awake long after the lights were off. I could hear the faint sounds of movement in other rooms, drawers opening, water running in the bathroom, footsteps in the hallway. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. There was something in my husband's behavior that unsettled me more than anger ever could have. He wasn't confrontational. He wasn't cold. He was calm. Too calm. And that calmness made me wonder if he knew something, if he knew everything, and was simply waiting. It was the waiting that frightened me. Because waiting meant there was a moment coming, a moment I couldn't predict, when everything would be laid bare. And lying there in the dark, I realized I wasn't afraid of that moment because of what he might say. I was afraid of what I might have to say back. It didn't happen with a raised voice or a slammed door. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, in that muted lull between lunch and dinner, when the house felt still enough to hear every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint rustle of wind outside. My husband came home earlier than usual. There was no announcement, no reason offered for the change. He walked through the door carrying nothing but his keys and the weight of something unspoken. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a cutting board, when I heard his footsteps behind me. He stood there for a long moment, leaning against the counter, watching me. There was nothing in his face I could read easily, not anger, not suspicion, not even the familiar tiredness he usually wore after work. He looked calm, almost unnervingly calm, and that calmness made my chest tighten. Finally, he spoke. "I know," he said. 2 words, steady and quiet, like he was commenting on the weather. The water was still running. I turned off the tap slowly, my hand stiff around the handle, my breath shallow. I didn't ask him what he meant, because I didn't need to. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply looked at me and explained, in the same steady tone, that he'd known for a while. That he had seen enough, heard enough, to understand. That it wasn't a surprise. And then, with a sharpness that landed like glass breaking in the middle of that calm, he told me the truth I hadn't expected: he'd left us alone on purpose. All those long nights, all those business trips, all those absences, they weren't just work. They were deliberate. "I needed to see what you would do," he said. The words hit harder than any accusation. I stood frozen, the room spinning around me, every thought in my head collapsing into fragments. He hadn't been oblivious. He hadn't been trusting. He had been watching, not through cameras, not through spying, but by setting the stage and walking away, waiting for the scene to play out exactly as it had. He told me he wanted a reason. Not closure, a reason. A way to walk away from this marriage with the weight shifted from his shoulders to mine. And then, in a voice that didn't shake, he admitted there was someone else. Another woman. Someone he'd been seeing, quietly, methodically, while I'd been here convincing myself I was the only one breaking vows. The room felt colder, smaller. I wanted to speak, to explain, to defend, but the words wouldn't come. There were no explanations that could untangle the knots we'd all tied together. In that moment, I saw him differently. Not as the man I'd been married to for decades, not as the absent husband I resented, but as someone who had planned this, piece by piece, leaving just enough rope for me to hang myself. And I thought of his father, upstairs, unaware of what was happening below. I thought of the nights, the silence, the choices that weren't accidents. The confession wasn't loud, but it was devastating in its simplicity. By the time he left the kitchen, there was no shouting, no dramatic exit. He just picked up his keys again, said he needed some air, and walked out the door. The quiet he left behind felt different from any quiet that had come before. It felt like the sound of something ending. The morning after his confession, the house felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. I woke up before the sun, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and for a long time I didn't move. The stillness pressed down on me, and I realized I didn't know what I was waiting for: an apology, an explanation, a fight that hadn't happened the night before. When I finally got up, the house was silent. His father's door was closed upstairs, his shoes still by the entryway, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I made coffee out of habit, though I barely tasted it when I drank it. The kitchen counter still held the faint outline of where he'd leaned the night before, keys resting by his hand as he told me the truth that made the air feel sharp. He didn't come back that night. His car never reappeared in the driveway, and his phone stayed silent. I didn't know if he was with her, the woman he'd admitted to, or if he was simply driving aimlessly, letting the road absorb his thoughts the way I was trying to absorb mine. By mid-morning, his father came downstairs. He didn't say much, just a quiet morning, but he looked at me differently, like he could sense the shift, even if he didn't know the words that had caused it. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table, his fingers drumming lightly on the wood. I wanted to speak, to tell him what had been said, to share the weight of it, but the words tangled in my throat. What would I even say? That my husband knew? That he had set all of this up, letting the silence do the work for him? That he wasn't leaving because of what I'd done, but because he wanted to, and had been looking for the cleanest exit? Instead, I stayed quiet. The day dragged on in a blur of small, meaningless tasks, folding laundry, wiping counters, straightening books on shelves that didn't need straightening. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the creak of stairs, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional soft thud of a door closing upstairs. By afternoon, I saw him packing. Not frantically, not in anger, but deliberately, carefully, like a man who had decided it was time to go. His father folded clothes into a suitcase, moved through the guest room like he was trying not to leave a trace behind. When I stepped into the doorway, he looked up. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was filled with everything we weren't saying: regret, confusion, the kind of ache that comes from choices you can't undo. "I think it's better if I find my own place," he said softly. His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't cold. It was simply tired. I nodded, because what else could I do? By the time the sun began to set, the suitcase was by the door, next to the shoes he'd left there the day he arrived. My husband came back just as the sky turned orange. He didn't storm in. He didn't slam the door. He walked in quietly, his face unreadable, his movements calm in that unsettling way that made my stomach twist. There were no harsh words, no accusations. He just saw the suitcase, glanced at his father, then at me. The three of us stood there for a moment, the silence stretching out like a wire pulled too tight. Then his father picked up the suitcase, nodded once, to him, to me, and stepped out the door. The sound of the door closing was louder than it should have been. The house felt emptier instantly. My husband didn't say much that night. He went upstairs, unpacked his bag from the trip, and didn't ask where his father had gone. I stayed downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold, staring at the wood grain as if it held answers. The next morning, his side of the bed was empty again. A note sat on the counter, short and final. He was leaving too. By noon, there were 2 sets of missing shoes by the door, 2 empty spaces where suitcases had been. The house was silent in a way it hadn't been since before any of this began. I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the space where he had sat, where his father had unpacked boxes, where I had tried to pretend the air wasn't heavy with things we couldn't say. Now there was just quiet. And in that quiet, I felt the full weight of everything that had happened. The line we'd crossed. The choices we'd made. The lives we'd unraveled. There was no dramatic ending. No slammed doors, no shouting matches, no closure wrapped in neat words. Just an empty house and the slow realization that once a boundary is broken, nothing is ever the same again.